During the Cold War, governments quietly reached a conclusion that runs against everything modern bunker culture promotes. When planners ran the numbers honestly, they realized that survival did not depend on deep concrete fortresses or expensive underground chambers. The most reliable survival strategy was simpler, faster, and available to ordinary people using existing buildings and materials. This episode explains the Cold War survival trick that repeatedly outperformed bunkers in tests, simulations, and real-world fallout events. And, well, why it still matters more than ever. Why Cold War planners stopped betting on bunkers. By the early 1950s, military and civil defense engineers had access to nuclear test data, radiation measurements, and structural damage reports. What they learned was uncomfortable. Purpose-built bunkers were expensive, slow to construct, and accessible to only a small fraction of the population. Worse, poorly placed bunkers often failed due to blast overpressure, entrance collapse, or inadequate ventilation. Meanwhile, studies showed that most casualties outside blast zones came from radiation exposure rather than structural collapse. This shifted the problem from resisting force to reducing exposure, and that change reshaped survival doctrine. How fallout protection mattered more than blast resistance. Cold War scientists discovered that distance, mass, and time were the dominant survival factors. Fallout radiation weakens rapidly when shielded by dense material such as earth, concrete, brick, books, or water. It also decays quickly, losing the majority of its intensity within the first 48 hours. A shelter that reduced radiation exposure by a factor of 10 or more was often sufficient for survival. This meant that deep bunkers were unnecessary for most scenarios. What really mattered was creating mass between the body and fallout, not, burying oneself permanently underground. That's why, actually, the most effective shelters already existed. Civil defense manuals from the 1950s and 60s, time and again, pointed to basements, subfloors, and interior rooms of large buildings as the safest locations. Underground parking garages, subway stations, and even deep interior corridors provided, excellent protection. The key, honestly, was positioning. The safest location was not at the edge of a structure, but rather near its center, surrounded on all sides by dense material. This approach, in fact, allowed millions to survive without constructing anything new. How improvised shielding actually outperformed permanent bunkers. One of the most surprising Cold War findings was just how effective improvised shielding could be. Stacking books, furniture, soil-filled containers, or water barrels dramatically increased protection factors. Experiments showed that adding just a few feet of packed earth or dense household materials could, reduce radiation exposure to survivable levels. A shallow basement, reinforced with earth and debris, often outperformed lightly built bunkers that relied on thin concrete walls. Flexibility, you see, mattered more than permanence. Why dispersal was the real survival strategy. The most powerful Cold War survival trick was dispersal rather than concentration. Authorities encouraged people to spread out into existing structures instead of clustering in centralized bunkers that could become death traps. Dispersal reduced strain on resources, minimized panic, and prevented catastrophic losses from single-point failures. How time worked in favour of those who stayed put. Radiation decay follows a predictable curve. Within 7 hours, fallout intensity drops dramatically. Within 2 days, it becomes a fraction of its initial danger. Cold War guidance emphasised staying sheltered during this window, rather than attempting dangerous evacuation. People who remained indoors with adequate shielding fared far better than those who tried to outrun fallout clouds. So, how can modern survivalists, apply this Cold War knowledge? Well, applying this method today begins with identifying the most shielded location in any building. Typically, below-grade spaces with thick surrounding walls are ideal. The next step is increasing mass. Storing water, books, soil-filled containers, or even dense furniture in these spaces really multiplies your protection. Ventilation is important too, but it must be indirect, making sure fallout particles can't enter directly. Now, bunkers might create psychological comfort, but they also introduce practical vulnerability. They require ongoing maintenance, secrecy, and honestly, perfect execution. Plus, they concentrate people and resources in just one location. Cold War planners understood that real resilience came from adaptability and redundancy. A household that understands shielding, positioning and timing can survive with far fewer resources than a bunker-dependent mindset assumes. What this reveals about forgotten survival thinking. Cold War survival doctrine was grounded in realism. It assumed systems would fail, help would be delayed, and ordinary people would need to act independently. The emphasis was not on heroic engineering, but on physics and probability. This mindset is largely absent from modern survival media, yet it remains the most evidence-based approach ever developed. Why this method still beats modern bunker culture. Technology is marketed as certainty, but history shows that simplicity and understanding outperform complexity. The survival trick was never about hiding deeper. It was about using what already exists more intelligently. That lesson has not expired. If this deep look into Cold War survival strategy helped you rethink what preparedness actually means, subscribe to In the Beginning and share this episode with fellow history enthusiasts and preparedness-minded viewers. The past still holds answers that modern thinking has overlooked.